Indulge me in a thought experiment for a moment and picture this scenario. A child is forcibly removed from his or her biological parents by a court of law which deems the biological parents to be unfit to look after this child. This child is placed with a pair of deranged, psychotic, abusive foster parents who treat this child worse than an animal, who feed the child scraps, who make the child sleep in the basement, and who do not give the child the same rights and dignity as their own biological children, right? So meanwhile, the child's original parents are fighting tooth and nail to get the child back from these monsters. And finally, when the time comes when the judge rules them capable of gaining custody of that child, the child is given the choice between going back to his or her biological parents, at least giving his or her biological parents a chance, or going back to his or her foster parents. And now the foster parents have realized that, oh shit, my cash cow is about to slip out of my hands, because, let's face it, a lot of foster parents are not actually genuine about their about taking in those foster children. They just see it as a business venture. Oh fuck, the cash cow is actually slipping out of my hand. I better change my attitude to the cash cow, so the foster parents suddenly change their attitude to the child 180 degrees. They suddenly profess to love the child as one of their own, to pretend to be so lovey-dovey, who actually give the child a bed to sleep in for the first time, and even bribe the child with a trip to Disneyland for the first time in his or her life. So, if you were the child, if you got to choose in this metaphorical situation between going back to your own parents or going back to your foster parents, who have a track record of being abusive, which would you choose? So there's this really half-assed liberal Western idea that's going around. Not just a liberal Western idea, even part of the establishment right, like Chris Patten have been going about parroting this idea that while, British colonization wasn't a walk in the park for Hong Kong people, at least it's much better to be a colonized subject of the crown than it is to be ruled by the autocratic, anti-democratic CCP, right? So this is an open message to Chris Patten, because I noticed that in the last few months, Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, has been going on this virtue signaling tirade, virtue signaling about how much he really cares about Hong Kongers, how it's his responsibility to safeguard the well-being of the Hong Kongers, and how the British colonists cannot simply abandon their former crown subjects, how they have a responsibility to give democracy. In the name of democracy, to come back and recolonize Hong Kong. Democratic crown colony. That does seem a little bit oxymoronic, but I'll get to that point in a while. You see, I have a low threshold for bullshit, and even though I generally support the right of Hong Kong to be an autonomous nation state free from Chinese or Western interference, I have a really, 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 really low threshold for bullshit. So whenever I hear all this white savior narrative that is peddled by people like you, Governor Patten, about how much you care so much about Hong Kongers, about how implying that Queen Victoria and King George, I mean, that implying that Queen Victoria had such a great love had such, actually spent sleepless nights worrying about the welfare of her Oriental subjects. I get really, really triggered at this kind of two-faced hypocrisy. You see, it's basically just like the proverbial wicked step-parents. The British colonists like Patten, you, Governor Patten, are now suddenly pretending to care so much about the people of Hong Kong, to care so much about Her Majesty's Oriental subjects, to care so much about the right of Hong Kongers to have democracy and to rule themselves, when we all know that the first democratic processes only took place in Hong Kong in the years leading up to the handover, because the British were simply trying to play good cop and bad cop. Now, don't get me wrong, mainland China is fascist to the core, so perhaps using that analogy that I use wasn't really a very good analogy, but I guess you can sort of get my point about all this Western virtue signaling, about how this false dichotomy that they create about how, Hong Kong has to choose between being a part of China or continuing its status as a subordinate to Great Britain, a crown colony, Yeah, it's a very patronizing false dichotomy. And I think that those people who parrot this kind of false dichotomy do not truly respect Hong Kongers and are in fact insulting the intelligence of the average Hong Konger. Because if you truly respect Hong Kongers as equal to a white man and not his subordinate, as intellectually equal to a white man, as equal and competent to a white man, equal in competence to a white man, then why are you encouraging them to push for crown colony, the resumption of crown colony status? Why are you encouraging them to fly British flags, to call themselves crown colony subjects in the name of democracy, when we all know that throughout British rule of Hong Kong, there was no democracy until the years leading up to the handover, when they wanted to play good cop, bad cop. Hong Kongers had no say over who got to be governor of Hong Kong. Every governor of Hong Kong was a white man who was appointed by London, And as a matter of fact, was Chris Patten, were you, Chris Patten, were you democratically elected by the people of Hong Kong? Now, you may say that you enjoy the popular support of the people of Hong Kong, but did you run for election? Did you actually run for election and let the people decide by the ballot box? No. You were appointed by Her Majesty, the Queen of England. That by extension does not make you a democratically elected leader, right? And for all those buffoons, all you buffoons who are waving like British flags, singing, God save the glorious Queen, God save the glorious Queen. You actually think, you morons actually think that your ancestors were sipping tea with English aristocrats? You actually thought that the British colonizers thought you were equal with an Englishman? That Churchill, using Churchill as the face of your mascots, as the mascot of your protests, do you honestly believe that Churchill even thought you were a higher grade of Chinese compared to mainland Chinese? You know, I don't know what they teach you guys in history class, right? I don't know what you're learning in history class, but if you actually believe that, then you are high on opium. You are deluded to think that the British colonized Hong Kong out of altruism, you know, to rescue them from mainland China, because you don't even know the very nature of how Hong Kong got to be a British colony, right? So, do you need me to teach you how Hong Kong got to be a British colony? Hmm? So, Hong Kong, you see, had been part of China for the last 2,000 odd years, you see. It had been Chinese territory for the last 2,000 odd years until the British strong armed Hong Kong out of China, you see, at the end of the Opium War, which the British themselves started because the Chinese were not happy. The Chinese did not allow them to sell opium in mainland China, right? So they started, which sparked the Opium War. Britain declared war on China, 1839, and in 1842, China had been trashed because of the, well, I hate to say this, but the superior technology of Great Britain at the time. So then China, that thus began the century of humiliation, when China was pretty much kicked around like a football for the next 100 years, you know, by the Western powers, the Europeans, the Japanese, and all of that. And you must be deranged to think that when the British colonizers were in charge of Hong Kong, that they actually thought of you guys as British. You see, there's a stark difference between a British subject and a British citizen. There's a difference between a subject of the British Empire and a British citizen. And the Indians under Gandhi understood that, you know. The Tunku Abdul Rahman, Lee Kuan Yew, Mahatma Gandhi, the freedom fighters who fought tooth and nail for freedom from Western colonization, understood that there's a difference between a subject of the crown and a citizen of Great Britain. They're not the same. To think that you, as a Chinese person, had the same kinds of rights and protections as a citizen of Great Britain during colonial rule, true colonial rule, not after the handover. That is a ludicrous and deluded idea, right? You know, when the British were defeated in World War II, and they had to, and basically when the Japanese were invading Singapore, you know, the British evacuated their own citizens out of Singapore. But they left the locals, the natives, the crown colony subjects out of the loop. And they left us to the mercy of the Japanese, like they did with you guys in Hong Kong. You know, Churchill would rather Hong Kong fall into Japanese hands than into Chinese hands, because Churchill himself was afraid of a rising China. You can look at the partition of China in Churchill's quote on the partition of China in 1902. Like he himself said, I believe that China should be partitioned from the rest of the world. And you morons think that he's not talking about you, right? You think that Churchill's not, when Churchill said that the Aryan race is bound to triumph, and you know, we must stop these barbarian races from rising. Do you honestly think that he thinks that you're an Aryan? You, a Hong Konger, do you honestly think that he thinks that you're a separate race from Aryans, or a separate race from mainland Chinese altogether? No, you're just a chink to him. I'm going to post a couple of very choice quotes made by Joshua Wong's hero and Sir Winston Churchill, yeah? And do you think during colonial times, right? True colonial times, not the half-baked colonialism when Britain became a toothless tiger, and you know, do you honestly think that Chinese people were accorded the same rights and the same legal protections as British citizens? You honestly believe that? Let me tell you a couple of really enlightening facts, right? I think that you need to be a little bit, since your history teacher didn't do it, looks like the onus is upon me to do it. Like 100 years ago, you and I, by virtue of being Chinese, would not be allowed to set foot in a respectable Englishman's public park, right? You and I would not be allowed to set foot in a respectable Englishman's neighborhood, you know? In fact, the signboards still exist even today, right? No dogs and Chinese allowed, right? You think your ancestors were like sipping tea with English aristocrats? You think they were dining with English ladies and gentlemen in pomp and splendor? No. They were pulling their rickshaws for a pittance. They were getting abused verbally and racially. They were called dirty, smelly, disgusting chinks. You know, Chinese women teachers were not even allowed, for the most part, to teach nice little white boys and white girls because it was assumed that, you know, it might corrupt the morality of good little white children, you know. So they had to segregate even Chinese children and European children. And because since it was assumed that Chinese women were these dirty, diseased whores, you know, Chinese women couldn't even teach nice little white children. I think it was only in the 1950s when the first Chinese nurse of Hong Kong was actually the first Chinese woman in Hong Kong actually got to become a nurse. So it is ludicrous to think that for most of those 155 years that the British were in charge, that they saw you guys as equal to them, right? And the only reason Christopher Patten, ironically, the only reason that he shows any respect to you guys, at least he shows the surface level of respect to you guys, is because of a strong China. If China was weak, if China was a weak country, as it was in the Century of Humiliation, Christopher Patten would be calling you guys Dong Beng Fu. He would be calling you guys sick men of Asia. And you can bet, right? You can bet that if China was still under the Century of Humiliation, Christopher Patten would support these laws, which these racial segregation laws that were put in place by his apartheid predecessors, you know. It's not that he doesn't want to, it's only because he can't. You know, that's the thing. That's the difference between won't, the modal auxiliary verb won't, and can't. How do I know this? Judged by the track record of the Hong Kong governors. Judged also by the fact that Christopher Patten does not regard you as his racial equal. Because if he did regard you as his racial equal, he would not be virtue signaling about how colonization is sort of like a necessary evil in order for the Hong Kongers to get liberty. In fact, I'm not pro-Beijing, but even the people in the pro-Beijing camp have got more respect for you idiots than Christopher Patten actually does. Because in his heart of hearts, because he doesn't seem to believe that you guys can make it on your own without being a British colony, he doesn't think that you are intellectually equal or equal in competence to a white man, right? That is in his heart of hearts. If he did, he would be telling you to stop waving those British flags. He would tell you to govern your own nation, like Singapore, you know. He would not be virtue signaling about how it's the responsibility of the nice white colonizers to the nice white saviors to rescue these poor helpless damsels in distress, you know. That's about how much he really respects you. He considers you a damsel in distress. So yes, to quote Shakespeare, Christopher Patten is but a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the global stage and will soon be heard no more. Yep. And of course, you know, he's just you, Christopher Patten. You're basically a relic of the past longing to stay relevant. You know? Don't bullshit, don't give us all that bullshit about how much you care deep down about the plight of the Hong Kong people. You're just, let's just call a spade, Christopher Patten, and say that you don't want Hong Kong to fall back into Chinese hands because it wouldn't feel nice for your white privilege to be eroded in Hong Kong, would it? It wouldn't feel nice to have the Hong Kong people stop worshipping you as a god, you know, a god by virtue of your white skin. No. And for many of you Westerners who share Christopher Patten's view as well, go fuck yourself, seriously. You know, the days of colonialism are over, right? All races presumably are equal. And of course, it doesn't feel nice to lose your white privileges, but that's how the cookie crumbles. We live in the era of decolonization, right? So unfortunately, Hong Kong will never fall back into British hands. Whether it falls into Chinese hands or not, it depends on the people of Hong Kong. If they show themselves to be competent, confident, and capable enough to govern themselves, then I don't see why it should have to fall back into Chinese hands. Like, they can call Great Britain and America their allies as equals, but of course if they regard themselves as subordinate to Great Britain and America, then quite frankly, they're not really ready for home rule. Because if you want a state of your own, then you got to prove that you can actually manage it without being supervised, without your hand being held by a white man, you see. So until then, you're not actually ready for home rule, right? You still need to overcome this sense of internalized colonialism, right? So, but Christopher Patten, you are a relic of the past. You are a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage, but will soon be heard no more. And global Western hegemony is simply a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Because the West has lost its place on the global stage as the main star of the show.